What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the early slate for Wednesday, May 22nd. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. And we have 4 MLB games today. Obviously, it shows 5 on the screen, but the Orioles and Cardinals are no longer on the slate. Their game yesterday was suspended, so they need to finish that first before they play today. So the sites took that off of their early slate. So we have 4 games today. No weather concerns that we have to worry about. Should be a pretty interesting slate to talk about. These short slates, I think, are a little bit more difficult to talk about, a little bit more interesting to talk about because there is more strategy. There is more game theory outside of just saying like, hey, this guy is good, play him. So we can get into that a bit more than we usually do on the bigger slates. If you have any questions, post them in chat. Happy to answer those, whether it's slate specific or strategy related. Give the video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel. All that stuff helps out a lot. And as always, if you are looking for a specific game, if you're rewatching this and building lineups, the game that I'm talking about will be highlighted up here at the top, so you can find it that way. And now we're going to start with Minnesota taking on the Nats in Washington. High actual total in this game. I did not run lineups yet, so that's a good start. Did I put my projections in? All right, so going to talk through this one without projections for right now. Was doing 20 other things before the show and forgot to run lineups yet. But we have Jake Irvin taking on Simeon Woods Richardson. Neither pitcher is going to look particularly good here. They are projected for 15 to 20% ownership just because it is a 4-game slate. So obviously that makes guys more appealing. 7,400 for Irvin, 6,800 for Woods Richardson. Not a good strikeout matchup for Woods Richardson. Mediocre strikeout matchup for Irvin. Neither one has very good strikeout stuff. But in the context of this slate, they're kind of just guys. If you're not playing Nats bats, if you're not playing Minnesota bats, then you can look to these guys because both of those offenses should have ownership given their matchups. Again, neither of these pitchers are particularly good so far this season. Irvin striking out 18.4% of hitters, only walking 4% with a 3.83 xFIP. So he has actually been good so far from a run prevention standpoint. We'll see if that continues. He probably will regress a bit going forward, but maybe improvements he made are here to stay and he will continue to prevent runs. Still not a great DFS pitcher because of the low strikeout percentage. Woods Richardson has a 20% K percentage, 4.05 xFIP, but keep in mind that he had a very favorable start to his season. He faced the White Sox, I believe, twice, faced the Mariners in a game where he struck out like 800 of them. So that is driving up his strikeout percentage a bit. He doesn't project to be a very good strikeout pitcher, but at 6,800, again, on a 4-game slate, you can certainly get there. The offenses are both going to look pretty appealing here. CJ Abrams looks great at 5,800, assuming that he's in the lineup. He's somebody that we can play against pretty much any pitcher. And obviously Woods Richardson is average at best. I would say most likely below average. So it looks like a very, very good spot for CJ Abrams. Then you get some Minnesota bats, decent values here with Kepler, Julian, Buxton, Larnach, all hitting in the top 6, all between 42 and 4,600 on DraftKings going up against Irvin. As I mentioned, Irvin has been solid so far this year, but he has still allowed a 245 expected ISO and a 367 expected WOBA to left-handed hitters. So he is still giving up power. He's still giving up production there, or at least expected power. His actual numbers allowed 184 actual ISO, 341 actual WOBA. So it's not like he's been great against them in terms of actual results, and expected numbers are even worse. So Kepler, Julian, Larnach in particular are going to look pretty appealing. Eddie Rosario is cheap going up against his former team. He has rebounded very nicely lately. Started out the season horribly. There was a lot of talk about how much longer he was even going to be on the Nats, but they had a long leash with him. He figured it out. So both of these offenses are just going to look pretty good in this spot. Happy to get to either one of them. Mets taking on the Guardians in Cleveland, another game with a pretty high run total. We have Tristan McKenzie facing Jose Quintana. McKenzie 8K, not a good strikeout matchup against the Mets. Also just not having a good season. 20% K percentage for McKenzie, 14% walk percentage, 5.11 xFIP. We know he's pitching through an injury, and the results have really not been very good. No real interest in getting him at 8K. The only case, I think, would be that it's a 4-game slate, and in the past, he's been good, but obviously he's got some extenuating circumstances here that he wasn't dealing with when he was a very, very good pitcher a couple of years ago. So I think it's very difficult to get to him outside of ownership considerations. For Quintana, pulling 11% ownership, the case for him is simply that he's $5,300 and he's a fully stretched out major league starting pitcher. So he is underpriced in addition to it being a 4-game slate, but it's still a very difficult strikeout matchup for a pitcher who doesn't have very good strikeout stuff anyway. This Guardians team is very difficult to strike out. So if you're going to Quintana, it is purely a pricing play here. I expect to be getting to more offense than pitching. The Mets look pretty good here. 4,500 on Lindor is a really nice price tag for him against McKenzie. Brandon Nimmo at 4,500 is a good price tag. We have a very cheap DJ Stewart at 3,200 batting fifth. That's a solid value. He has power. Pete Alonso from the right side. Don't care that he's facing a right-handed pitcher. He still has a ton of power. So far this season, lefties have done the bulk of the damage to McKenzie, as you would expect. 14.8% K percentage against lefties, 26.7% to righties, 308 expected ISO to lefties, 411 expected WOBA. Righties, on the other hand, sub 100 expected ISO, 261 expected WOBA. You definitely prefer these left-handed bats. Again, that's not to say that you shouldn't be playing Pete Alonso because he is Pete Alonso. But Francisco Lindor, Brandon Nimmo, DJ Stewart, these guys look really, really good. JD Martinez, Mark Vientos, if you're stacking the Mets, feel free to play those guys. They're pretty cheap. They're in solid spots in the order, but it's the lefties that really stand out based on what McKenzie has struggled with so far this season. It makes Lindor, Nimmo, and Stewart look fantastic at their respective salaries. None of them are expensive. They're all in good lineup spots as well. On the other side, Quintana doesn't miss a lot of bats, like I said, but he is generally decent at limiting power. 176 expected ISO to righties this year is a little bit higher than you normally get from him. He has also allowed a 385 expected WOBA. If you go back to the start of last season, his expected WOBA allowed to righties is 348. So we probably see Quintana pitch a little bit better going forward, getting more soft contact. But so far, he has struggled a little bit this year. Jose Ramirez is very expensive at 5,900, but he still is going to look like one of your top third base options on a 4-game slate. Jimenez, Fry, Freeman all look fine. Quintana's not lights out against lefties either. Obviously, for Jimenez, it is a lefty-lefty matchup, but since the start of last year, Quintana's actually allowed a 234 expected ISO to lefties. So if you are stacking Cleveland, getting to Jimenez is fine. David Fry batting cleanup. Tyler Freeman leading off at 3,500. Solid values there, but the lefties for the Mets look like the very obvious spots to get to. Next, we have not the Orioles taking on the Cardinals. Again, that game is not on the slate, so do not play them. Detroit taking on Kansas City in a game with the two most talented pitchers on the slate. Tarek Skubal taking on Cole Reagans. These are two of the best left-handed pitchers in all of baseball facing off here in Kansas City. Now, this park is good for run scoring. It's good for everything offensively with the exception of hitting home runs. It's the worst park in baseball for getting strikeouts. All of that said, these pitchers both look like clear priorities on this slate. Skubal and Reagans both projected between 45 and 50% ownership. Skubal striking out 31.6% of hitters this year. 27.8% K minus BB percentage is the best of any pitcher pitching today, regardless of which slate they're on. 2.52 xFIP is excellent. Cole Reagans, not quite as good this year as Skubal, but still very, very good. 27.6% K percentage, 3.21 xFIP. He does have the better strikeout matchup taking on the Tigers. So both of these pitchers just very, very clearly look like top plays. Offensively, the only case I think you can really make is both of these pitchers are getting 45 to 50% ownership. So if one of these offenses comes through and you have them, you've created a very clear path to the top of tournaments, but they're also clearly very low probability plays going up against two pitchers that are as good as Skubal and Reagans are. Bobby Witt Jr. coming off the massive game yesterday, always somebody you can get to individually. I think that's a reasonable approach here. It's a 4-game slate, so it's sort of the borderline of where I typically start getting one-offs against the pitchers that I'm playing. But somebody as talented as Bobby Witt Jr. that also gives you stolen base upside, I don't mind getting there. Like if you have Skubal and you have Bobby Witt, that's going to make you a little bit contrarian because people aren't going to play them together as much. And Witt can have a good game even without hitting home runs off Skubal. Like he can double, steal a base, end up with a home run worth of fantasy points without even scoring a run potentially. So I don't mind getting there. Riley Green, lefty, tough sell, but he is good. Mark Canha is expensive. Again, I don't really have much that I would expect to get to from the offenses in this game. It's mostly just in your larger field tournaments. If you're just stacking against 50% owned pitchers, that's never a terrible strategy. But obviously, these guys are both really, really good. Finally, wrapping things up with the Angels taking on the Astros. We have Hunter Brown on the mound for the Astros. We have Tyler Anderson going for the Angels. Hunter Brown is the clear best SP2 value. 6,500, solid matchup against the Angels. The Angels have been hitting well recently, but overall, it's a below average lineup with no Mike Trout. Hunter Brown started the season slowly, but has started to come back closer to the numbers that you expect from him. He's up to about a 23% K percentage for the season, 4.08 xFIP. He is still walking too many guys with about an 11.5 to 12% walk percentage. But again, part of that is because he started the season so slowly. So at 6,500, he's just still priced down from his slow start to the season, even though he's getting back to, more in line with the numbers that we expect from him. So I do think that he looks like a very good SP2, and I'm certainly very happy to get to him. The ownership at 31% is pretty high, but I still think that it's warranted. I would expect that I'm somewhere around the field there as well. Now, if you wanted to get away from that ownership and go to like Jose Quintana at a third of the ownership for a cheaper price tag, that's fine. Obviously, Quintana is going to beat Brown a decent percentage of the time, but Brown is the higher probability play. There is a gap in talent between Brown and any of the other cheap pitchers on the slate, and then there's the overall gap in talent with Reagans and Skubal. So those are the three guys getting the most ownership. On the other side here, Tyler Anderson's not a bad pitcher, but it's really difficult to roster him from a DFS standpoint. $7,600 price tag, brutal matchup against a Houston team that just does not strike out, whether you're right-handed or left-handed. Anderson's not a great strikeout pitcher anyway. So I think he's probably it's between Anderson and McKenzie probably for the most difficult pitcher to get to on the slate, I think. Like in the Minnesota-Washington game, I don't love either pitcher, but they're both cheap and it's easy enough to get there. McKenzie at 8K dealing with what he's done so far this year, and then Anderson in this matchup at 7,600, I think are the two most difficult pitchers to get to. Houston, the matchup against Anderson is fine. Again, he's not a bad pitcher so far this season. Anderson only striking out 17.7% of hitters, does have a 4.9 xFIP, which is higher than usual and probably higher than it will be by the end of the season. Lefties this year do have a 250 expected ISO against them. Righties are at 207. Going back to the start of last year, 202 expected ISO for lefties, 181 for righties. So again, while he's not a gas can, he does give up power. And notably, when you're talking about a left-handed pitcher against the Astros, he is a reverse splits guy, at least to some extent, which makes sense because he does have a very good changeup that he relies on. That's a pitch that typically is more effective against opposite-handed hitters. So you have Yordan Alvarez, you have Kyle Tucker, lefty-lefty. These are both very good hitters against left-handed pitching, and Anderson's not great at getting lefties out. Since the start of the 2022 season, 367 expected WOBA, 229 expected ISO in 536 plate appearances against left-handed pitching for Kyle Tucker. Yordan Alvarez, even better than that, with a 406 expected WOBA, 266 expected ISO in 438 plate appearances against lefties. So again, individually, as two-man stacks, as part of full Houston stacks, whatever it is, Alvarez and Tucker look like two very, very good hitting plays, even though it is lefty-lefty. And then you get into, Altuve, Bregman, Pena, the rest of these guys that all look solid. I did get a set of lineups to run now, and Houston is showing up, like I expected them to, pretty much in line with the field. The Angels are showing up as well, which I do think they're a pretty interesting contrarian stack, because when you think about where the pitcher ownership is going on this slate, as I mentioned before, it's Skubal and Reagans pulling 45 to 50%, and then Hunter Brown pulling around 30%. And Brown did show up in about 27% of the lineups that I built. So I don't disagree with the ownership coming into Brown. But if you ask me, would I rather be stacking against Tarek Skubal, Cole Reagans, or Hunter Brown? The answer is certainly Hunter Brown. Now, that is going to be the case for the field as well. Like you can see 18% projected ownership to Rengifo, 10% to Ohapi, Calhoun getting 8%, Moniak getting 6%, Ward's at 14%. So it's not going to be a contrarian strategy going to the Angels in the sense of they're really low owned, but it does give you negative correlation with a 30% owned pitcher, where if the Angels do well, you are knocking about a third of the field out of contention. So they do have that leverage. Whereas if you're going to Detroit or Kansas City, you're getting that same negative correlation or even more of it, but you're also getting a really low owned team. The trade-off is that you're stacking against two of the absolute best pitchers on the slate, two of the better pitchers in baseball. So it's clearly a lower probability spot. Rengifo, second base, and third base eligibility at 4,400 looks good. Ohapi, 4K catcher, looks good. Again, assuming these guys are in the lineup, because we don't have that lineup yet. But both offenses in this game are appealing. Houston more so than the Angels. And then Hunter Brown looks like the best SP2 on the slate as well. Now I'm going to quickly just click back through the previous games and see if anything stands out as far as me getting a lot more or a lot less than the field on anything. Offensively, in the Kansas City and Detroit game, I am slightly over the field on the offenses, but nothing crazy. That doesn't really surprise me there. Pitching wise, getting right around a little below the field, but close to the field on Skubal and Reagans. Again, it's telling me that they're a little bit under-owned or over-owned rather, compared to the chances of them being in the optimal lineup, but you're also not trying to build the actual optimal lineup in MLB, because it's a fool's errand. That's never going to happen. So when you factor in the probability, how likely it is that these guys do end up being a top two pitcher, they're going to most likely show up in a lot of the lineups that I build. Clicking over to the Mets and Cleveland game, Quintana, I do think is going a little bit under-owned. I figured it would show up that way. McKenzie, pretty much where he should be. A little under-owned technically, but nothing too crazy there. From a value standpoint, though, Quintana, I think, is just a decent play, even though the strikeout upside isn't really there. Offensively, the Lindor showing up a lot. Completely agree with that. The field's there as well. Jonathan Rodriguez, 2K, showing up a lot. I honestly don't know who that is, but at 2K, batting sixth against Quintana, no problems with that. Not going to be able to find that quickly, so never mind. Pete Alonso, DJ Stewart, David Fry, Brandon Nimmo, all the guys we talked about showing up the most for me. Nothing that stands out there. And then finally for Washington and Minnesota, I'm going to guess that I'm a little bit higher than the field on these pitchers. Right around the field, a little bit over on Irvin, a little bit under on Woods Richardson. Probably a function of factoring in improvements that Irvin has made and then thinking that Woods Richardson still isn't very good. But they're both just completely secondary pitchers for me. For the field, they look fine. From a hitting standpoint, Keibert Ruiz showing up for me the most. I don't know if this is a mistake in ownership. Maybe it comes back down, but Edward Julian, projected for 30% ownership right now, showed up in 10% of my lineups. I'm going to guess that's a mistake in ownership, but if not, I think he's going over-owned. I think he's a good play against Irvin, but not that good of a play. CJ Abrams, Ryan Jeffers, Correa, Buxton. No surprises in the names showing up there. As far as all stack types go, the Mets and Cleveland showing up the most, followed by Houston and the Angels, Nats, Minnesota, and then Detroit, KC rounding it out. So nothing that is overly surprising there. 5-man stacks, Mets showing up the most against McKenzie. Angels and Washington jump up a little bit, probably because they're pretty cheap. You can make high upside stacks at reasonable prices with both of them. Houston and Minnesota, very similar to the Nats as well. Drops off a little bit with Cleveland, and then again, Detroit and KC at the bottom. So that's all I have for you on this one. 4-gamer. Don't be afraid to be different in tournaments, especially the larger field tournaments that you're playing. Again, it's not going to feel good stacking against guys like Skubal or Reagans or even Hunter Brown with the Angels necessarily, but you need to do something to be different. So whether it's finding low-owned guys, maybe going to a lower-owned pitcher, lower-owned SP2, or being willing to stack against popular pitchers, don't be afraid to do so, especially in those larger field tournaments. Other than that, thank you for checking out the show. Give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and we'll be back at 5 p.m. Eastern for the 10-game main slate. Obviously, we'll have quite a bit more to talk about there. Thanks again. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.